Get a drink upstairs. I was told that I could come 20 minutes late because it's Brazil and you can be kind of laid back. But we're gonna get started and be prompt because that's what we're like. So a couple changes to our program. You'll notice there's four presenters. You're only gonna see two of them that are listed, but you also see another third one that we'll get a chance to present as well. So. Look for slightly different presentations as listed on schedule. But anyway, we're welcome to our next research session. We're going to see three additional papers on homeschool research. I'll give since we have three papers, I'll give the authors up to 20 minutes if they want, but I am going to cut you off strictly there, and you don't have to take all 20 minutes. We do want to leave enough time for Q&A. I don't imagine you'll take all 20 minutes. Although I don't know, Brian, if you might. So anyway, without further delay, I'm going to ask Lindsay to kick us off. Oh, she will.
Oh, I will. A little. But while we're getting that pulled up, the orange one. My name is Lindsay Burke. I am an Education Policy Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And I do that by day, and then by night I'm also working on a PhD in Education Policy and Research Methodology at George Mason University in Virginia. But most of my time is spent at Heritage. I do a lot of work on school choice generally, of which, of course, I would consider homeschooling to be a part of that wonderful and growing landscape of educational options. So Deborah said, you know what, they've really got statistics fatigue, so why don't you present a theoretical paper? So I said, okay, I'll present something a little more theoretical so you can give your brains a break for a minute. So I want to talk today, apologies for the clunky title, but avoiding the inexorable push toward homogenization and school choice with specific lessons for the homeschooling community. So today, options outside, and I am speaking about the US specifically, but options outside of the traditional public education system are becoming increasingly mainstream in the US. 28 states and the District of Columbia have some type of school choice option. And by school choice, I'm thinking of school vouchers, so public funds to attend a private K-12 school, sometimes pre-K, tuition tax credit scholarships. From the position of the child, this works the same way a voucher is. It's basically a coupon to attend a private school of choice. But the financing mechanism is different. It is funding that never goes through the hands of the state. This is either corporate or individual contributions to nonprofit scholarship granting organizations that then provide a scholarship, e.g. a voucher, to a child to attend a private school of choice. The donor gets a dollar for dollar tax credit in most cases. And then the new cool kid on the block of school choice, which is education savings accounts, ESAs. And ESAs are, we would refer to them sometimes as school vouchers 2.0, but these are the idea that a family can get a portion of what is spent on their child in the public school. The family chooses to exit the public school. In most cases, there are 5 states that have them to date. They get 90% of what the state would have spent on the child in the public system, right? 90%. It's just the state per pupil allocation. So in the US, we have federal, state, local dollars, 90% of the state per pupil allocation. But families can then use those on a host of education-related services and products and providers. So you can pay for private school tuition, individual online courses, you can purchase curricula, purchase textbooks, you can hire private tutors, you can roll over unused funds from year to year. So we have the first school choice option to date that actually, I think, at least has the potential to put some downward pressure on prices. So it's a pretty interesting school choice mechanism. We have done a fair amount of work evaluating how families are using their ESAs, and just of note, Arizona became the first state to create ESAs in 2011, and the homeschooling community in Arizona was very specific about their requests, and they said, we do not want to be considered in statute ESA users. We want to be distinct in statute. So while many families, and by many I mean about 31% of families in Arizona use their ESAs like homeschoolers, we call them families who are schooling at home versus homeschooling families. So we keep that distinction there. So we have a growing world of school choice. Those are just the allowable uses of education savings accounts today. So the school choice landscape is growing. At the same time, homeschooling in the United States has also seen rapid growth over the past decade in particular. We've seen an increase in the percentage of families who are homeschooling from about 2.9% a decade ago, that's of the US student population, to about 3.4% today, or about an increase of 1.8 million students since 2011 alone. So the growth in school choice options and homeschooling has been considerable in recent years. But despite that growth, students in the traditional public education system still represent about 90% of all students in the US today. And I do include charter schools when I'm talking about the proportion of students who are choosing an alternative option. So more than 49 million students remain in traditional public schools today. So you can see, it's a little bit blurry, but you can see traditional public schools there on the right, about 49 million students, charter schools, homeschooling, and the little sliver there that says private school choice programs, that's inclusive of vouchers, tuition tax credit scholarships, and education savings accounts that I mentioned earlier. So even though it remains a small slice of the market in the US, we are seeing significant growth in school choice programs and in homeschooling. And so, of course, I think it goes without saying, but part of what advocates hope to see when we see growth is that we actually see a diversity of school supply proliferate and a diversity of options. And I'm even thinking about homeschool co-ops and everything that includes, that we would see a diversity of school supply. Yet, as homeschooling and the field of school choice becomes more well-established in the market, there will be what has been identified in organization theory. There will be this inexorable push toward homogenization of options. And this is something that DiMaggio and Powell put forward in 1983. They did seminal work in the field of organization theory and pointed that out, that and they argued as well that organization theory has largely been concerned with variance among organizations. Even if you think about the field of statistics, much of what we use in the field of statistics, the tests that we use, are tests that are designed to determine variance among different entities. So if we think a little bit about organization theory for a second here, sorry about that. If we think a little bit about organization theory, we have two camps within the org theory world. We have the systemic structuralists who contend that the individual is only a component of the system, an irritant that must be controlled so that the overall functional integration of an organization can be maintained, right? So an irritant, that's the systemic structuralist. On the other hand, we have those who take a strategic choice view, that this is more of an inductive approach to thinking about organization theory. And so these folks define systems as aggregated outcomes of many individual acts, right? So two camps. Astley and Van de Ven, who also did some seminal work in organization theory in the early 80s, suggested a reconciliation of the systemic structuralist and the strategic choice views. And their reconciliation, they said, escapes the one-sided strategic lens subjectivism of action theory while resisting the functional determinism of systemic structuralists. So we have a reconciliation of the two camps. Stated differently, this reconciliation acknowledges that individual action is curbed within systems, while at the same time, systems never perfectly integrate into the larger body in which they reside. So stated differently, and I thought this was an illustrative quote, the player remains free, but if he wants to win, he must adopt a strategy in reasonable conformance with the rules, since a complete abandonment of the system cannot serve his interest. So what does this mean for homeschooling? What does this mean for school choice? Central to the argument in favor of school choice and homeschooling is the idea that practices will differ across schools and across maybe homeschooling co-ops and practices in order to meet family needs and to reflect local demands. But as homeschooling and school choice grows, will we actually see that diversity that we all hope to see? Will we actually see significant diversity in education methods and significant diversity of school supply? So organization theory applied to homeschooling and school choice helps us think about that question. Within organization theory, institutional theory specifically examines why organizations take on the characteristics of other organizations over time. So this tendency toward homogenization is referred to in organization theory as institutional isomorphism. When operating under the same set of conditions, isomorphism holds that an entity will begin to take on characteristics of other entities. For our purposes, that same set of conditions, to me, means regulations, specifically state regulations on homeschoolers, and I'll return to that shortly. So there are three types of isomorphic pressure that can be imposed on organizations. And here again, I'm thinking about schools as organizations, and if we're extending this to homeschooling, maybe homeschooling co-ops as organizations. So we have coercive isomorphism. This is formal and informal pressure to conform to the strictures of existing systems. And here I would lump this idea of state or other regulations that are in place, coercive regulations. And then we have mimemic isomorphism, intentionally copying other organizations to gain legitimacy. And then we have normative isomorphism, just what it sounds like, this idea of what schooling should be, unintentionally adopting the values or practices of other organizations. So for instance, schools might structure their school day to run on a 8 to 3 clock because that's what we've always done. We might get summers off because that's what we've always done. So this idea of normative isomorphism. Of great concern to the homeschooling community is this first threat, coercive isomorphism. We have examples from private school, the private school voucher world in particular, of what can happen when regulations from the state are overly burdensome and create formal pressures to conform to the existing system. So in the state of Louisiana, we saw this play out to great effect, and unfortunately now we have literature that shows the impact of what regulations have done in that state. Louisiana enacted to start, New Orleans enacted a voucher program in 2008. And in 2012, the voucher program went statewide. And when it went statewide, the voucher program added on significant regulations to schools that would choose to participate in the program. So for a private school to participate, students had to take the state test. So any student using a voucher, and not just any and not just any nationally norm reference test, but the statewide test. Students had to take that. Students had to, or schools had to report to the state anytime there was an absence of a student who was using a voucher, daily attendance records, they had teacher certification requirements, the list goes on and on. It was probably the most restrictive regulatory environment for a private school choice program to operate in that we've seen so far. And this is why I bring this quote up again, just to recall a second ago, right? The player remains free, but if he wants to play, he has to conform to the existing system. Otherwise, it won't serve his interest. So for private schools to participate, they had to adopt all of these regs. And what we ended up seeing in Louisiana was something that was incredibly concerning, and that was the low rate of private school participation. Only 1/3 of private schools agreed to participate in the school voucher program in Louisiana, 1/3. That meant that the other 2/3 were leaving tens of thousands of dollars per student per year on the table every year because they were so worried about the overly burdensome regulations that were in place. And so Brian Casita, Patrick Wolf, and Evan Rhinesmith did an evaluation where they talked to school leaders who chose to sit it out, that said, thanks but no thanks, we don't want your voucher money, the regs are too burdensome. And their number one reason, I know it's a little hard to see, but their number one reason, these were schools that chose not to participate in the voucher program, their number one reason for not doing so was fear of future regulations that would come with program participation. So a theory is that in Louisiana, the regulations that were in place encouraged one type of private schools to participate. And unfortunately, what we're now able to see is that those private schools that were financially troubled in the first place, that those private schools were already seeing declines in student enrollment prior to the introduction of the voucher program. And those were the schools that were in fact willing to incur the regs in order to participate and receive subsidies. So as Louisiana suggests, in highly regulated markets, the answer to whether or not we can expect to see diversity of school supply is no, that we are likely to see one type of school participate. So Louisiana is, I think, an instructive case study. It's perhaps a canary in the coal mine for regulations on homeschooling in the states. But there are also other types of isomorphic pressures that we need to keep in mind when thinking about how to foster a good supply of schools. Will schools simply copy other schools to conform to existing rules to generate social legitimacy? Will school structure be constrained by the unwritten rules of what society considers schools to be? Will schools incorporate rationalized myths, adopting the vocabularies and organizational language of schools that preceded them? And will they copy the existing beliefs of the environment in which they operate out of fear that not doing so will create the perception that they are failing schools? So there are many other types of isomorphic pressures that can be laid onto private schools, and I would argue other sort of unschooling options as well. So all of these normative ideas that constrain education can be applied to homeschooling. Central to the argument in favor of homeschooling is the idea, as I mentioned before, that practices will differ over time. 5 minutes, perfect. That practices will differ over time and will differ in a way that meets parent and family needs. Yet when isomorphism occurs, it fails to add diversity to a given sector, limiting the variety of educational options that are available to families. History suggests that homeschooling is unlikely to become isomorphic over time, but heavy regulations do appear to limit participation. Oops. For example, I apologize, this is difficult to see as well, but this is HSLDA rates the rate of participation by region in the US of homeschooling and has a framework of regulation, of the burden of regulation on the states. And so you can see in the left there that we have heavy regulation, and then the next category is moderate regulation, low regulation, and no regulation states. So the no regulation states for homeschooling, just like what it sounds like, a nice free homeschooling environment. All you do in those no regulation states is homeschool your child. You don't have to inform the state. You have complete autonomy in those states. And we have a good group of those states that are no regulation states. On the moderate regulation states, or I'm sorry, on the low regulation states, you just have to inform the state that you are homeschooling. So the burden's slightly higher. You have to let the state know that you intend to homeschool, but that's about it. On the moderate regulation states, you have to have your child take some sort of test, but that could be any type of test, not a single Louisiana style test. It could be any nationally norm reference test, or you have the option of doing some other measure of student achievement. So maybe that's a student portfolio, but there are some reporting requirements to the state. And then in the heavy regulation states, and they are heavy indeed, not only do you have to take a nationally norm referenced test or some other sort of test, you have to be a licensed teacher in many cases to homeschool, and in many cases even have to allow the state to come in to evaluate whether or not you are homeschooling appropriately and to otherwise check in on a homeschooling family. So these are the heavy regulation states. You can see that in the heavy regulation states, the average, and it's cut off at the bottom there, but the average participation rate of homeschoolers is about 2%. So in the heaviest of regulated states, we have below average participation rates on the part of homeschooling. And then it gets a little higher with lighter reg states, and then drops down again in the no regulation states. There could be many factors at play as to why that number drops down a little bit, not the least of which is the very understanding that homeschooling is an option in the first place. I think the good news from this perspective is that there are only a handful of states that are considered the heaviest regulated states in the country. So just to sum up, in order to make sure that we do in fact foster a diverse supply of providers, whether that's private schools in the private school choice market or homeschool co-ops and a light regulatory touch, in order to avoid isomorphism of practice over time, we have to keep these regulations as low as possible and to an absolute minimum. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. This time I'm going to ask Dr. Baojun to come up and introduce herself and present some of her work from China. All right, give us one moment while we set up here.
And first, I will thank Deborah and thank the organization to give me a chance to introduce what is happening of the homeschooling families in China. It's an honor to give me a chance to study with all the researchers here, because in the past 2 days, and several of you asked me, are there any managed homeschooling families in China? Is it legal? Is it forbidden? And such questions. I'm come to know about the homeschooling from 2012 from a classmate of me. He is higher than me. He's a homeschool father, graduated from the Peking University. I'm also graduated from Peking University, but he's higher than me. And his story was spread and was spread widely by the reporters and the news because he taught his own son at home. This not happened very often or in the past few years. Then my report, so it just gave me a few years to give observation of these families. So I want to tell the stories of these families, not by the abstract the describe. So through this brief report, I hope to make more people to know how the families in China, under the influence of Chinese traditional culture and modern Western civilizations, as well as Christian values, at the same time deal with the multiple values. Because in China, some of the homeschooling families, compared into two parts. Some of them are Christian families, and others are not. So they will face the conflicts about the multiplied values. They have such problems. Currently, Chinese in the period of social transformation, where on the social cultural level, there are a lot of drastic changes. For people who have accustomed to living within the system for a long time, they are facing many practical tests when they are out of institutional education and select homeschooling. Although many people have realized that homeschooling does not conflict with the internal spirit of education law, because Chinese law didn't forbid for homeschooling, but it's not openly. The way out of education means a great deal of concernity. In the past few years, the question has been settled now, but in the past, if your children want to go to the university, you must go to school, because if you don't have the school identity, you cannot enter the university entrance. No university will accept them. But in about the past 5 years, this problem has been settled. If you can get the identify from the street you live in, you can enter the entrance test. And many Chinese are born to be instituted with accommodations and living protection, even the way of thinking of future development by the state or by the unions. They don't know how to live or how to judge by themselves outside the systems. It makes them will freak out. With regard to the parents for homeschooling, many have more advanced education concepts and ways of thinking. In Chinese society and the transformation period, multiple values make impacts on many consciousness fields of such parents. Multiplied value of education philosophy leads to the conflicts and integration in consciousness field. The insight of education lies in absorption and innovation. The process of conflicts and integration of value also reflects the growth progress of the education himself. Though we have conflicts, but we can gather them together and we will move on to improve. In long-term observation of homeschooling families, I selected 3 most respective families. I will tell them 3 of them of their stories. One comes from Shanghai, this is my hometown, and one is in Guangzhou, a big city, and the other is a friend of Mr. Chen from Taiwan. Yes. Yes. They are all living in cities or metropolitan area, which near the big cities, where the cultural horizon is wide, and it's helpful for children to accept multiple values. Their education resource is rich. The parents of the 3 families are active, participate in activities of communication church and communication. They are outgoing and talkative and fond of sharing their own wise with others. And I send my issues, my 3 questions to the families. So I show the pictures of the background. Later I will explain. So see the pictures about the inside in the system, education system schools. They will study at about nearly 10 hours studying, from 7:30 to nearly 11 o'clock. This thing happened on my son. To entrance. Every 3 hours, they will have 10 minutes rest, just to go to the toilet. This happened on millions of Chinese children. And this is my Casey's family's photo from Hannah. Is a mother of 4 children living in Shanghai. She comes from a Christian family. She and her husband are Christians. And this is another Casey's family, Mr. Zhang. They are living in Taoyuan in Taiwan. And the 3rd family, Mrs. Sui, she wants to keep his privacy, so she don't want to show his pictures, especially for his younger son. His younger son is now studying in Germany for music. And this is the homepage, the website of the Chinese homeschooling website. So it's mostly the information about Chinese. If you interested, you can email me. I will give them the the translated materials. So I sent the Casey's family the 2 questions. I want them to tell me how they deal with the conflicts about the value confliction. And I want them to tell me about their daily life, not the abstract descriptions. So the 3 families tell us, the Hannes family said, our family education is following the Bible styles. There are subjects including Chinese, English, mathematics, history, and so on. And the Bible is to the essence of the whole system. It cannot. I want to show the family pictures, then you can. It's this family. And I became a Christian at the age of 35, which happened 17 years ago. And I realized, believe, the blessings start from the new life of Jews after expressing and tasting the God's moisture. I could also like to make my kids experience this life. My origin of education is to teach my children to know Jews. My eldest daughter sat in the church for the doing witness on Mother's Day when she was in the high school. Thanks to that, I have a mother like this, seeing the relationship between God and me transcending all. For these many years, the God has been guiding me and teaching me and guiding my family with change of life. We read Bible and pray every day, and I will take my kids to pray when they get into trouble. If there is no church and support from it, I couldn't insist it to do homeworking, to go homeschool until today. We usually teach children at home to learn to be grateful, to share, love and forgive, care, serve and dedicate. Children do not have this quality in nature, and we couldn't get them only by training. By behavior training, one hand, and by telling them the gospel of Jews on the other hand, we can find to make God guide them. God, with all kinds of learning, makes me not only focus on the children's behavior, but also cultivated children's heart through behavior. So his answer may be respectful of the Christian families. Mr. Sui, he's a dad from Guangzhou. He's not a Christian. He believes in the traditional culture. So his answer is very different. He said, my personal understanding is that the 2 values are respective at the conflict between personal system and the legal system, social value and individual value. I think the solution would be thus: the neutralization history and dialectical thought in Chinese traditional philosophy can be explained that the law must be obeyed, but with flexible use under the inviolable circumstances such as war and terrorist attacks, in which personal system is superior to legal system. Personal value sometimes is above the social value. For example, I don't agree with the children to join the army. Sometimes personal value is under the social value. For example, I don't agree with leaving a legacy and tend to be all out donation, just like Bill Gates. He agreed, things like that. Mr. Zhang, and he grew up from the traditional family and he became a Christian. So he answers, my wife and I are homeschooling. I think it's as a long life learning at any time as a family unit. My wife and I all think Christian faith coincide with the ancient principle in China, like feeling the heaven and respecting the nature, which is the common faith of my family practiced in daily life. The sooner the better training. We think so. We make the kids to recite the classic when they begin to read. The 4 children are beginning to recite the classical since they are at the age about 3 or 4 years old. Now the eldest son has been adult and graduated from the college. He had become a musician. For example, about lessons, Chinese, English, Bible in Greek, as well as the Book of Song, Dao De Jing, are the basic teaching materials. As children growing up, we will try to tell them this classic spirit or application with daily life. As field for the humanist, materialism and asceticism diverse from the Western culture and combining with the evolution, they should also be introduced to kids by parents at the right time and be explained why we don't accept them, because they live in a communication that all the people are live in the Chinese traditional culture. They are the only Christian, so they face some problems. So, I want to know how long I will left. By 6 minutes or so, I will move on. I will move to about the conclusion. Yeah, the conclusion. The first, these homeschooling families cannot get out of the background of the traditional culture, even though the Hannes family, accepting almost all the Christian philosophies, couldn't deny that the Orient traditional philosophy has been infiltrated into parents' thought systems. The key point is how to break through the limitation that one has present from himself, not the limitation for the object environment set by value systems. And second, in the families, they all properly absorbed the useful experience of Christianity or Western civilization. The mainstream Western values, mainly based on the Christianity, provide the family with more functions in such aspects of advocating personality, independence, and innovation. The family tend to combine the two values, the value education in Bible and the valuation system of Chinese traditional culture also have a lot of things in common. For example, the Chinese traditional emphasize humanity and concern, which reveals the nature of love. And the Christian culture advocates the love of God, especially in New Testament, which emphasizes more about love of toleration and acceptance. And third, yes, I showed the stuff mostly. As for the building the value, it seems that the Christian family are more robust and systematic. Church organization threaten the building of value system. However, the Eastern traditional value system tending to individual self-protect seem to be more easily affected by some uncontrolling faction. It means the Christian families can gain much support by their community. Yes. These families are usually paying more attention to building the values. The pictures about the children from Zhangzhou playing pianos have little concert. This happened every maybe half a month, happen often. Yes, they are very close. The relationship between the parents and the children are more harmonious. They are more determined for homeschooling and have courage to deal with the secular constraints and challenge. After more than 30 years of reform and opening up, Chinese society returned to the value model, taking the family as the core. A great number of families had begun to change the material, investment, and the cultivator of the ability of technology for the kids to the raise of special and buoyant gradually. For most homeschooling family, they are relatively clear the key part of the education is to build the value and special value. There are a large number of families with school education also realize the problem. Paying attention to mental quality promotion has become the conscience of many parents because they found that paid much attention to the test score as do harm to the children's emotions. And I have the left problem that cannot settle. For the progress, I feel sorry for having no time to view from the kids for the questions because of lacking of deep interviews. And I have chat with the parents, interviewed, and sent emails. But the children answered me very little because they have heavy study tasks at this time. Due to the homeschooling in China, it's still in its infancy, and many kids are teenagers. Their expression for values still remains to be perfect, and it needs time to consider how they are facing the opportunity of the world with their own internal values and how they raise their children. So I will continue my research. Thank you for listening. That's all.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll invite Brian, our last speaker, to come up.
Good afternoon again. Right, so this was kind of fun because I got to just dream up something to try to do in time for this conference, which was a ridiculous idea, but I tried anyway. And so I think it's kind of fun what we...
Testing, yeah, there we go.
Oh, there we go. So, but I think you'll find it interesting. I'm kind of enjoying it. The topic is an international comparative study of the barriers to parents choosing to home educate their children. And here we go. So, maybe. Is that it? Okay. So my purpose was simply to try to identify, understand, and compare the barriers to parents in nations all over the world in choosing to home educate their children, and then maybe propose some solutions if you want to think about how we could remove those kinds of barriers. And I'm having a little trouble here. There we go. The context is that there are many studies, at least in the United States, and they're growing in other countries, on why people homeschool, whether the parents or the youth who choose to homeschool, in nations ranging from Australia to Canada to the United Kingdom to the United States. That's just a tiny sampling, but there's scant research on what might be inhibiting people or stopping people from choosing to home educate. So this is just, for those of you who want references, there you go. Okay, so sorry Tim, but just some samples. Blaine Dupre in Canada has talked about systemic resistance to home education, as in the education profession. You might want to read that if you haven't. Okay, and Marion Karsten, who live in the Netherlands, I don't know really where, I forget where their university is. They discuss the restriction of parents' rights using, by law, and that has come up here a couple of times in some of the research, and so just on and on. But I want to get to what I found, and you want to get there too. So here we go. Based on past research, mostly, and my experience, I came up with 7 different categories of barriers. And here they are: legal aspects that might restrict or serve as barriers to homeschooling, whether there are or are not support systems for home education, the opinions or actions of various persons or groups, parents or young people's personal experiences, the costs and resources available regarding home education, and concerns regarding the parents' children, and finally, the parents' personal views or resources. So I just put out a big broadcast of trying to find people any way I could, largely through home education organizations, and that will fit into one of the criticisms I had from somebody in this room about my research. But anyway, we'll get to that later. Okay, so the target population was parents who are or might homeschool their children. The sample size at the time of this analysis was just a little over 1,100. It's popped up now to over 1,500. So it's online right now, and I'm going to try to do something with that. The online survey is divided up into several sections with 106 items, mostly Likert type, strongly disagree to strongly agree as the response options. I'm sorry, that's a little small. Here's some demographics. Do you have at least one school-age child? 95% yes. Are you currently homeschooling? 87% yes. 10% men, 90% women. And there's some education level in there. It's a lot like we've been finding in many other studies. By the way, on that note, this is just sort of off on a tangent. For many years in the United States, the media and some academics, I won't get into motive. Anyway, they tended to represent the homeschool community as wealthier and much more highly educated and disproportionately white Anglo. The white Anglo was true, but as far as the disproportionately wealthy is not true, both in my research and in government-funded research, which of course must be correct. But it's just kind of interesting. They tend to be median income, at least in the United States now, on average. And here is, again, just to give you some idea of the variety of people involved. Yes, heavily Christian, but yes, also I have agnostics and atheists and Buddhists and Jehovah's Witnesses and Hindu and Mormons and so forth. Just to show there's some variety in the sample for this study. It's not totally homogeneous. So then what are the barriers or not? Okay, just so you know, the responses could range from 1 to 5. And when you look at the numbers now, think bigger number, there's more agreement that it is a barrier. So big number, it's a barrier in the perception. Bigger barrier, big number, bigger barrier, stronger barrier, whatever you want to call it. Higher hurdle, okay? Higher hurdle. No potential barrier had a mean of 4 or higher. Just to give you some idea of the range. I'm trying to be not too technical, but a little bit technical here. 13 barriers had a mean of 3 to 3.9, and I think I'm going to show you that one. There are just too many. I don't want to talk about all of them, but these were the strongest barriers. These, what did I say, 13? 13, yeah. So those show you the strongest barriers, just a simple listing, descending order, the biggest barriers in the opinions of these parents and people. Look at number 1. I attended public state schools where school practices preceded me, in other words, historically, and neither I nor those I knew had experienced an alternative reality such as homeschooling. This is the strongest barrier these people told me is why they didn't or wouldn't, or it's hard work to homeschool children. I thought that was really interesting. That came up so high. My community's expectations of what education and schooling should look like, which to me was interesting watching the research of, who was that just up here, about isomorphism and so forth? Yeah, okay, yeah. But I'm editorializing, I shouldn't do that. I'm supposed to be just presenting research. Okay, so public school personnel's negative attitudes and comments toward homeschooling. And then I want to point out for some of you in here who are professional educators, look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Professionals, experts are not supportive of homeschooling. And then we get down to public opinion in general, and then back to experts claiming that homeschooled children are not well socialized. So that just gives you an idea. Oh, now look at scholars show up again. Look at 4th from the bottom, scholars show up again. So this seems to be pretty high. Just kind of start to infer here a little bit, and you'll see some summary statistics later. The 10 weakest barriers. So I'm showing you the strongest barriers and the weakest barriers, just because that's the way I decided to do it for now. The weakest barriers, the lowest, my children are not supportive. That's the weakest barrier. I'm not sure what that says, but second to the lowest, Homeschooling is legally prohibited in my country or jurisdiction. That's the second lowest. Now remember, this is international. Think about that. This is an international blending of all these data. So my spouse is not supportive. It's the third weakest. All right, so let's keep going here. Now I'm trying to synthesize this down a little bit. So what I did with that, I then took these 106 or so items and tried to see if my idea of what the categories are would work out in coming up with subscales. Some of you are familiar with that in terms of using Cronbach's alpha to see if I have this reliability, internal reliability. And in fact, I was happily surprised at how it came out, because these numbers on the right, the Cronbach's alpha, are pretty respectable for having never done this before. I mean, I just came up with my own questionnaire, but I guess I had done research a while, so I had some idea of how it might work out, but I was happy to see how the numbers came out. For those of you who don't know, these Cronbach's alphas range from 0 to 1, and the higher the number, the more internal reliability it's said to have. So each of these scales, the lowest was a 0.668 if you want to round up, to got up into the 90s. So that's pretty decent for that statistic anyway. Okay, so now, this is just saying that I did one thing, saying that the means do significantly differ from one another. Okay, is there any statistical significance? Yes, they do vary. So, keep going. Wanted to look at the opinion actions of others. That's the subscale, the opinions and actions of others. And then in those, I listed the means from highest to lowest. So this is one sub, if you're following me here, in the opinions and actions of others. I'm not there yet. Come on, there we go. And it gives you some idea. So these are the ones that are the strongest barriers overall, and then within that category gives you an idea of what's going on. And I was pretty fascinated to see that community expectations, public school personnel's attitudes, the public in general, the experts claiming they're not well socialized, scholars and academics, negative attitudes, and private school personnel, negative attitudes, and then the university and college policies. So I think we see a lot of how high these are overall in terms of negative barriers to homeschooling. There are more of them here, so then it's down to the weakest. So let's go on to the costs and resources. That had 6 items in it. But the costs and resources was the second highest of the 7 categories in barriers, as barriers go. Limited financial means, lack of money, financial costs, lack of money, parents do not have time, and both parents need a full-time job. By the way, that elk is from Oregon. I like animals. The third category was the adults' personal experiences. So I'll just let you look a little bit yourself. Public school authorities, not friendly. Public school authorities or personnel explicitly antagonistic toward homeschoolers. Then the next, in descending order, the next biggest barrier as a group would be legal aspects. Homeschooling is legal, but policies about homeschooling are burdensome. Homeschooling is legal, but regulations are burdensome. How is that different? Only but I think I might have had a double thing there somewhere. Homeschooling is legal, but
Almost the exact same policies.
oh, it might be regulations in general. Lack of legal support. Homeschooling is legally prohibited, period, in my jurisdiction or country. All right, so I just gave you the top 3 or 4 subscales. It's a little too much to watch over and over and over. you can look at the paper if you want to see more. What needs to be done here? Again, more time, more effort. I just presented only 4 of the scales to you. I think I need to come up with a better way to condense this a little bit, clearly. And I don't know who else, but I want to thank Albert a lot for giving me feedback. I don't know who else looked at it. They don't want to admit it. No, that was it, but it's good. And here's just a quick overall, because people do want to know, are there any differences between the nations in what I found? Yes, but I don't have it all down to the particulars yet. There are definitely differences. And it's complicated. How do you lump different nations together? I mean, you could go by continent, but then there's so much variety in South America. You could go, I'm not sure. This is going to be challenging to think about how to do that. Maybe there's a way that can be factored out statistically, or maybe there's a conceptual way somebody can help me with that, because I'm not sure right now how to do it.
Use that index we saw, the
Oh yeah,
index.
maybe the educational index. The country explains about 20% of the variance in the legal scale scores, about 14% of the variance in the support system scores, and then it starts getting pretty small. 7% of the variance in opinions and actions of others, only 5% of this personal experiences. I'm not surprised about that. Only 3% about costs and resources, and only 1% of the concerns of the children. But that was way down at the bottom anyway, so that's not surprising. Like I said, I need to come up with some meaningful way to figure that out. What are some working conclusions? He also lives in Oregon. It's the black bear. Of course, please note that this is a work in progress. And again, thank you for helping me think about this, Albert. These data are mostly from respondents who are already homeschooling. But how in the world, how do you, I mean, I would have to be very purposive in trying to find those who are not homeschooling, which could be done, but takes time and money to do those kinds of things. 5 minutes, all right. I'm going to finish up here. To some extent, homeschooling parents have already overcome the barriers, so they might have a little different view about this than somebody who's just right on the edge. Maybe somebody just, oh, I just met a friend who homeschools. That's interesting. They start thinking about it. How is that person thinking? I'm not sure, but it would be good to find them. And it is important to know what people who are homeschooling think, but it would also be interesting to find out more who are not homeschooling. We have some up there, but not a lot. Okay, so what I can see so far, the strongest barriers to homeschooling have much to do with the opinions and actions of others. That pretty well leapt out here. That just really leapt out here. For example, experts claiming that homeschooled children are not well socialized. Homeschoolers being discriminated in one's country or community. The person's own church not being supportive or being antagonistic toward homeschooling. Public opinion in general, university and college policies being discriminatory. The second strongest barrier was the costs and resources available. Both parents need a full-time job, lack of money for curriculum, and parents do not have time. The least obstructive group of barriers was children's concerns. So that's just what we found so far. A little more. If it's a good thing to see more home education around the world, it appears that public and community opinion must be addressed to see homeschooling be more accessible. It might seem obvious, but that's what the data say here. And I think I'm close to the end. Homeschool organizations can work to educate parents on how they can homeschool their children with the resources they have. And they might think about working with public opinion makers and scholars and experts. Because if not, I wanted to put this up earlier, but this is the unbiased researcher saying hello from Oregon, and it's missing 2 of the grandchildren, okay? This guy, for those of you who are from the south of the equator, my second son-in-law is from Brazil. He's a Brazilian, Campinas, Sao Paulo. If you want to stay in touch, that guy does not live in Oregon. That's Florida. That's how you can stay in touch. And I'm finishing early, Albert. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Actually, why don't you stay up here, Brian? I'm going to ask the researchers to come back up, and I'm going to open it time for comments, questions, suggestions, anything. So I'll walk around with this mic and pass it along for people who have questions.
Lindsay, this is for you. I found that so fascinating. I've never been exposed to these theories before, but wouldn't homogenization just occur over time naturally, like regression to the mean?
Yep.
Is that a factor?
That's the theory, and that was basically what DiMaggio and Powell put out in their 83 paper, was that over time organizations do just naturally tend to homogenize. So yes, that is sort of a regression to the mean issue.
And what's wrong with that?
Well, if our whole purpose of choice of homeschooling is to have diversity in methods, diversity of school supply, then that is an inherent threat to that diversity being cultivated.
So the homeschool communities should assume, like in the United States, that right now I would say the homeschool movement is diversifying in terms of demographics and also structure, but over time, we would start to look the same.
Yeah, and I think one of the last things I said was, historically, we haven't seen that type of homogenization with homeschooling. But again, it is such a small share of the market right now. I think what we're more likely to see, if we saw it at all, would be maybe among homeschooling co-ops starting to mimic others. And I think Brian and I need to sort of combine our analyses a little bit. I mean, your biggest barrier to entry seemed to be this normative idea of schooling. So even, as it sort of, permeates the homeschooling community, I think that normative idea could be one barrier to cultivating diversity of options.
Well, so I don't know, I'll give you a chance to respond, because the thought came up that, so when we hear the stories of people, the parents who start homeschooling, and the first thing they do is they basically set up a classroom with a board in the living room, right? That's what I've heard. And that, they're copying what they know from school.
Yeah.
I don't know, from your experience working with a lot of homeschool families, I mean, do you see this tendency to try to mimic and
You're exactly right. My first day of homeschooling, that's what I did.
She has a mic.
Yeah, that's what I did my first day of homeschooling my twins in kindergarten. But I think over time in the homeschool community, it looks less like school.
Yeah.
Now, I do think we may be starting to look like one another,
Yeah.
but I think we look less like school over time.
good or bad in your
It was good for, in my estimation. That was what I was going for, so.
And again, I think in the homeschooling community, it's far better insulated from that isomorphic pressure than other types of schooling options, right? We are more likely to see this in things like the charter sector and even the private school choice sector that's financed through things like vouchers, which I started off with, and tuition tax credit scholarships. I think we're far more likely, particularly because of the regulatory environment in states, to see that happen to these other growing sectors than to homeschooling. But I think we should be vigilant of the impact of regs on it.
Lindsay, this is also for you. And I thought your reference to the Meyer and Rowan piece was really interesting, that they have to sort of proactively or reactively mythologize themselves in order to protect from isomorphism. And I was wondering if you had any examples of that.
Not off the top of my head. That's a terribly unsatisfying answer. I'm sorry.
We'll just know what to keep a lookout for now.
Yeah, but I will just add one thing. It's sort of a blend of the two of your. So my husband and I live in DC, and we've noticed that, if you live anywhere that has Uber is this great thing, right? It's this, diverse option to getting around, and have sort of kind of unbundled the transportation sector. But what we've noticed over time is that in a relatively small town, maybe the services has started to decline a little bit. And the theory is that it has sort of captured all of the former cab drivers over time, and now all the former cab drivers are just driving Uber, right? And so I think there are other sectors that we can look at where we see this sort of regulatory capture happening that could provide some lessons.
I was actually thinking about Teach for America.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Yeah.
To like be different than the new teacher project.
Yeah.
And other sort of
Yeah, that's a really good example.
digital pipelines.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Baojun, 谢谢. You talked about the difficulties that the families had working with Chinese culture. What elements of Chinese culture are very different from the homeschooling culture that created some of the problems or difficulties that they faced?
Maybe the traditional Chinese traditional culture emphasis on the union and the obedience to the authorities. Because you answer you raise up a question and you do the things unlike others, it will maybe seem different, and maybe will seem to be rebellion for the authority. You may feel pressure. It's our cultural customs. But on the other hand, I think it's some people that the misunderstanding of the Confucian traditional, because I have taken a short documentary of Confucian, but maybe have no time to show up to you. There are several researchers rethink about the Confucian his thoughts. His thought is very different from the people's misunderstanding, just like this. And I also have questions want to share with all the researchers here. I'm also a homeschooling mother, and I think how to choose the way. One way is about the elite education. Me and my husband and some of my friends are the production of elite education. It means we graduated from the very famous school, we get higher income, we look successfully, but inside we feel empty and sad. Because I tell the reason why we are trained at very long hours to doing tasks. And so I think maybe the homeschooling are another way of elite education. I'm puzzled. Or another way is a kind of to see the children to grow up with his natural way. I'm confusion. I still find the way. It's the two kind of ways, or they combine. Because I have been a psychologist, work for 8 years, and my research focus on the high IQ children. I have planned such plan on my third children, and I failed. So I chose to homeschooling.
Well, I don't know if anyone has thoughts about that, or. So essentially, so if I understand it correctly, how do you balance the two views, right? So yeah.
As opposed to individualized versus natural learning, or institutionalized?
I think the question was, there's a third interpretation of the original question. The question was, should a homeschool education be very academically elitist driven, or it should be more follow the child natural development? Unschooling, exactly, thank you.
I think Nick or Lauren, I do think the homeschool graduates have to answer that, because I do think the three of us, I mean, I think we were very academically driven, and at the same time telling ourselves we wanted to individualize. Do you have any thoughts on like what your parents did that you thought was most beneficial for you as individuals?
The mic's coming to you first, actually.
And you should say what you're doing now.
Well,
Okay.
what you did this is a homeschool graduate.
Yes.
What did you do last year?
So I spent all of 2014 on a Fulbright grant in the north of Brazil, in São Luís, working on a research project there. So my research is not in education, but I am a researcher. But that is a very interesting question, and I think in my experience, what I really got out of being homeschooled was the freedom to be interested in the things that I was naturally interested in. So my parents definitely did a good job of balancing what we learned and how, making sure that we got a well-rounded education, but I was also just given the freedom to be as as obsessed with or interested in the things that I was naturally inclined to be interested in. And that has really come through in the choices that I've made as a student in the future, and the choices I'm making in my career now as a researcher. So I think it's important to be well-rounded and to understand the currency that is academic achievement, the way that academic achievement can position you in your society or in your culture to do well or to be successful. But there's also the element of just being encouraged to be who you are, and being encouraged to be attentive to your own desires and to be attentive to the things that you are inclined to be interested in. And I think that your natural giftings and your natural talents will then be really encouraged in a way that isn't it's more well suited to an individual than a system could be equipped to provide. I hope that made sense.
Do you want to add a few?
I don't have much to add to that, except to say I think the benefit of being homeschooled was I learned how I learn, and I learned how I solve problems. So I remember being given the choice to go to public school, I think about 6th grade, and really knowing myself well enough to know I wouldn't do well there. And I also remember sort of writing my own academic objectives as young as 6th grade and then repeating that process. So just the intentionality that I had invested in my own education, I think was really powerful. And then I was able to take that into every context, whether it was teaching or graduate school or working with other teachers, whatever it's been, those same principles have followed.
In 6th grade, I only wanted someone about
For the webcast, Nick only wanted to learn about whales in 6th grade. Right? Although, I will just add, before I hand it off to Ray here, that, I suppose this is a question that we could answer empirically, right? I mean, we do, I don't know if we have data access to,
We're creating a research project right here for you.
right, so certainly here in the U.S. we have different types of homeschoolers. Really, the research base is really thin on what happens to these children when they become adults, right? A lot of our theories about, is the unschooling method better or the academically focused method better? The evidence on that's actually very, very minimal. So certainly it's ripe for research.
And I was going to give anecdotal comments because I don't have the research base behind it. But over the years, many times we've had people call us with their children burned out in school, hating school, and asking us, what do we do? We've tried a number of different ideas, and the one that seemed to work the best is we would tell them the first thing you should do is take 2 or 3 months off from formal school and take something that the child likes and then just dig deep into that. And as they dig into that, then start adding, well, okay, now that you're looking at that, write a paper about it. Now that you're reading about that, let's look at some of the additional science. And so we would then start adding the academic subjects to it, but find something that the child liked, dig into that, and that was the advice that worked the best of the different things that my wife and I have used over the years when we would get that type of call.
I know Brian had a question, or I'll open up to the audience first. Tim? Okay.
This is my fourth take on the third reiterational question. Okay. What Dr. Bao is describing is very common in first-generation homeschoolers. The struggle have in Taiwan because you don't want to fail. You have the entire you represent the entire sector. You really don't want to fail. So, and the way the school look at the success of homeschooler is academic result. And it's very easy for homeschool parents to drill their kid hard, especially, everybody read about the tiger moms. And so we have in Taiwan, we have homeschool parents who who would get their kids up in a routine that wake up at 4 a.m. 4 a.m. And yes, that's a local time zone, you know. And 4 a.m. and then go through the drilling, and then until about 10, 11 p.m. So there's a tendency towards that, and I think one needs to fight that tendency quite strongly, and then just say, actually, you don't need to represent the entire homeschool community. You are you, and he's a very cute boy, by the way. So you really don't need that. And so what if both you and your husband are graduate from the Beijing University, and you are professor at the Beijing Film School? It doesn't necessarily mean your kids will follow your footsteps. I mean, they will grow up to be bright young men and just do whatever they want to do. And I think that is part of the responsibility as a homeschool parents, to hold on to that social pressure, which is what Dr. Brian Ray has commented about. It's the opposite pressure, it's like the whole society thinks we're not good enough, so therefore we have to fight harder to become better. But I think we're way beyond that. We're above that. Sorry.
That was so well.
And I will say, since it's a research panel, I suppose that researchers can do their parts in thinking about, one, the kinds of outcomes that they measure, but two, even research questions such as asking what are goals of homeschooling families, and why do parents homeschool, to I guess frame the conversation of what outcomes we really want to look at. I think that there's room for researchers to pitch in here as well. Brian had a question?
That's a very good point, Albert. If home education is about something other, what is the other? Okay, but I do have a question for Bao. So this is fascinating about in China, because I had a son and a daughter live there for 5 or 6 years. And then 3 years ago, I was invited to be a keynote speaker on homeschooling. Just had no idea why, just all of a sudden what is happening overall in China with homeschooling? Do you think, is it growing fast? Is it a little trickle? And what is the cultural opinion about it, if anything? What's going on in terms of overall in China? Do you know?
You mean happened to the homeschooling families?
Is there an increase in homeschooling, and what is public attitude toward it?
You mean the public think about the homeschooling?
Yes, and is it growing in numbers very fast?
We will have the called the WeChat. We use the mobile phone WeChat, and I have 5 WeChat groups to observation about the homeschooling family. Each group have about 400 to 500 members.
WeChat is the Chinese Facebook. So if you're wondering what
Yeah.
WeChat is.
And I think the public opinion about homeschooling, they are not known just like our European, American, and Latin research to the homeschooling families. They know little about them. They think they are mysteries because they gather together and just like some of them are Christian families. They think it's a mystery things. And homeschooling families want to protect themselves because it's not openly in China. They want to be disturbed by others. So it may be a question. And I spent a lot of time to gather their trust, and they would tell me their stories and their feelings, their thoughts. It may be. And I have other cases about how for the system, the education system, to think about the homeschooling. Many school leaders, for the schoolmasters, the teachers, may think it's better to accept as homeschooling a child because the child will study hard, he is intelligent, he is good at sports and music, and his school identifier is put in the school. In China, children must have a school identifier. So you can get a graduate book to to identify I'm a student from which school. And you must get an identify. And he will attend the final test every term. You don't have to go to school every day, but you will attend the final test, and he will get the highest test, the highest score, and he will, and he can attend several challenges and things like that. When he gets the honor will belong to the school. So it's good for school. So the educators in China thought about the homeschooling families, and the public not knowing very much. In my group of WeChat, some people asked, are the most richest Chinese families taking on the homeschooling? They're very rich because they have free time, they don't need to work. I said no. And other parents asked me, if the most poorest people, they cannot afford the cost of schooling to, so they know little about. So I made a broadcast. I will send the newest news happened in my WeChat every day in my group. Just now, before I give my speech, from the WeChat, I sent the news to them. It's very late in China. They waiting to see the news.
Okay.
Okay, do we have other questions or comments, suggestions? Yeah, sure. Yeah, you've exceeded your quota.
I just want to make a brief observation. I mean, Brian and I both went to the conference in Beijing, and basically, there are no qualitative study about homeschool status in China as of today. Something Brian can think about doing it, or Ms. Bao. Yeah. I mean, sorry, quantitative. I mean quantitative. I'm sorry, I meant quantitative. So the number of homeschooler is everybody's guess, and the number is the number I've seen is somewhere around 3,000 to 50,000. It is wide. It varies widely, and also depends on how you define homeschooling. Yeah, I mean a lot of it comes to the definition of homeschooling, but I think the Chinese homeschool market is going to be a very interesting one because it kind of solved several different social issues in different areas. So some of you may have known about the internal migration issue in China, whereby people from rural area move to the urban area, but their kids have their household remain in the rural area. So they are denied basic services such as education in the urban area. So homeschooling becomes an option whereby they can get education. And they eventually get their student ID by somehow accumulate 12-year worth of transcript in 1 month at the end of the 12th grade, miraculously, and then go on to university. So that's happening. And also it's another way for the urban elite, like what Dr. Bao was talking about, some of her friends, that they think the current school is not hard enough. It's not pushing their kids hard enough, so they want to take their kids out of the system and drill them even harder. So that's another extreme of the case. And then there are also people who don't trust the state school system, and they want to bring the old home class back to the traditional, the old traditional education back into the current school education. So they want to reintroduce the whole classic education. And there's a big movement of that, and that's happening in both rural and urban area. People just take their kids out of the school system and put them into co-op and then recite classic 14 hours a day, and and just memorize the whole text. And so it's in a very wide spectrum, and I encourage all the researchers here, you included, to take the opportunity of the big China rush. Thank you.
Dr. Ray, I had several questions for you. First one is, how many families do you need to have to create a statistically significant sample for a country in your study? Did you have a number on that? And second, I'd like you to comment on the fact that the second lowest item in terms of a barrier was the legal right. And we've been talking both 4 years ago and this year at this conference about how we need to get the laws changed. It looks like the laws aren't stopping anybody.
Yeah. This is a statistical answer. If I knew I had a random sample in each country, I'd only need about 30. And some of you understand that, but I don't have any random way to get a random sample. But I just have this subjective feel that if I could just get 20, I could talk about a country. And so there's some I'd like to work on. Then to answer the thing about legal, I think maybe the legal barrier being low is a function maybe not of its real importance, but if we sort out by particular countries, that legal barrier might be very high on the list here. That's really important. I mean, that's one of my limitations of my analysis so far, is I haven't carefully looked at different countries. So if we sorted out, like in the United States, we took the 50 states and went high, medium, and low government control. If I sorted these nations like that and then looked at the parents in those nations with high government control, then all of a sudden it might go way to the top.
So I'll just,
Is that
since we're
fair,
on this
Albert?
note-
Is that
no,
fair?
That's possible. I think it's a more plausible explanation.
Oh, okay.
Which is your sample is consisting totally of people who've already homeschooled.
Already, yeah.
So if they're already homeschooling,
Yeah.
they're doing it, and they're probably doing it in countries where it's already legal. So why would they care, right?
Or maybe they live in
So-
Brazil and they don't care anymore about the law. They just do it.
Right. So as a suggestion, off the top of my head, I mean, I suppose you could, if you have access to some, I don't know, national level data, just get everybody, and hopefully, you'd be able to ask certain questions like that, and that's not going to catch the marginal homeschool, the person on the fence, but at least it would get a sample of non-homeschoolers, and you get a sense of what they're like compared to your homeschoolers.
You could throw in a question, have you ever considered homeschooling
Right,
your
something
children?
like that.
You could just toss that in. All right.
All right, I think we have time for one more.
Well, I was just wondering, it would be interesting to look.
It's for the webcast.
Microphone.
It would be interesting to look at something like the World Values Survey, which is a random sample survey of every nation, and see if there are proxies for the things that you're asking, even just to get some kind of index, like if there's some sort of respect for the law, or there are a number of things like that might be available to you that you could at least use as an index for the nation, and use that as some sort of control.
Thank you.
Okay, and on that note, why don't we give our presenters one last hand? Thank you very much.
I have to make an announcement.
Go ahead. You want to come up?
Oh, okay. You don't want to relinquish the mic? Okay. All right, I'm supposed to thank everybody for attending, and really thank you to Albert and to Lauren and to Dr. Ray for moderating the research sessions for us. That was quite a great service that you did. So right now, we are to meet back upstairs on the 10th floor in half an hour at 6 p.m., 1800, for our closing session with a reception that will follow. So thank you, everybody, for your attendance and your participation.